Hello everybody and welcome to the week 3 hangout, which is on the truth about dogs and cats. Unfortunately, Nat has hurt her back and so she's not going to be here with us today. So instead we have drafted in Heather Bacon, who would be your tutor in week 5 on captive wild animal welfare. And of course, you know Hayley Walters from week 3, and Hayley has been your tutor for the last couple of weeks. We've also this week had the launch of our street dog film, which was made by the same cameraman who made all of our MOOC films. We took him out to India with us. I say we, Heather and Hayley took him to India, and he made this amazing little film called Street Dog, and we absolutely love it. We're really, really proud of it. It's our baby. And if you want to use Street Dog as a teaching resource, as a tool, even just to promote animal welfare, education and animal welfare in other parts of the world, please feel free. It's on YouTube for people to use and to really share and explore. We're just really promoting that animal welfare message. And first, I think just before we start, do you want to tell us a little bit about what India was like when you went over there?
Yeah, well, India is, as you can imagine, a very vibrant, busy place. Lots going on. Nicer weather than Scotland, as you might expect, and just really dogs everywhere. And generally, the majority of street dogs in the area that we were in actually were quite well fed. They were quite well looked after, and there were charities there working to try and generate positive human-animal interactions by making sure the street dogs were vaccinated against rabies, so they weren't a threat to the local human population. And also by neutering them to make sure that the population was controlled as well.
I think as well it's something which most people, particularly in the West, don't realise, is that street dogs are not necessarily, just lost our camera there for a moment, that's why I went weird. We're back. But street dogs are not necessarily unowned dogs or necessarily always what we'd think of as wild or feral dogs. They're very often looked after by people, just not necessarily in what we tend to think of as a typical pet context. So it's a very sort of complicated relationship, and one of the really important things about the street dog video was that we were trying to show how if we improve the human-animal bond by making these animals more healthy, vaccinating them, preventing the spread of disease, preventing yet more puppies being born, we can really improve the human-animal bond there. So it's very exciting, and please do go watch the street dog video after the hangout. We have been using it as a trailer for the hangout as well. And can I just say, if you do like these hangouts and these videos, remember to like, share and subscribe to them on YouTube, because then YouTube will show the videos to more people and more people will get the animal welfare message. So always remember, like, share and subscribe. Okay, so let's get on with some questions from the week. I think it's been a very interesting week. There's been loads of very interesting questions, and we have printed out some here. And remember, you can ask questions in the app as well. So what do we want to start with, Hayley?
I think a lot of you were interested in the ladder of aggression and also fear-based training. So we did have some questions about high-profile trainers who are still promoting the alpha dog concept and the fact that we need to dominate our dogs. And if we don't dominate our dogs, then they will try and dominate us. And the theory being that there is a top dog, and its aim in life, any dog's aim in life is to be top dog, including over its own owner, which we now know through a lot of research and a lot of study is completely inaccurate. And that dogs just want to live a very simple life with their owner or with other dogs on the street. They don't belong to a pack as such. There is no top dog. Dogs either live with us, they're humans, or they congregate around resources. There's no pack, there's no dominance hierarchy, and that's been proven over and over again. And so we had people asking if fear-based training could be recommended or can be effective. And my answer to that is it certainly can be effective. We can train any animal or any human, adult or child, through fear-based methods. But what we need to be asking ourselves is what kind of relationship we want to have with our pets, relationship we want to have with our dogs. or even what relationship we want to have with our own children or brothers, sisters, family, whatever. And if you want a relationship that's based on fear, and they will cooperate with you and do as they're told from fear of being alpha rolled or shaken by the scruff or having electric shock collar placed around them, if that's the kind of relationship you want with your dog, then that is your choice. But we know that reward-based training is far more appropriate, far more rewarding for you and for the dog. And also you're going to have a better harmonious relationship and a dog that wants to please you and wants to do things because you've asked it to, not because it's scared of being punished.
I think one other thing to consider as well, I think in addition to all the points that Hayley's outlined, is that fear-based training can sometimes have inadvertent consequences. We know that increasing fear in dogs heightens their reactivity, and dogs that are more reactive are more likely to respond negatively and unpredictably. So it actually increases the likelihood of aggression being displayed. And that's actually something that we see with dogs, particularly dogs that are anxious or perhaps on the ladder of fear aggression already. And then if they have a trainer that comes in and uses fear-based methodologies, they can escalate up that ladder of aggression quite quickly in response to the training program. And that actually can be really detrimental both for the dog and for the trainer or the owner. A really good example of that is food aggression. People often see that as a dog trying to dominate a food resource. And there used to be old-fashioned advice about being able to take your dog's food away from it. Imagine if you were sitting at home at the dining room, you're having a nice meal with your partner and your family, and all of a sudden your partner reaches over and takes your plate away and doesn't let you have it. Your initial response to that would be, that's a totally inappropriate action. How dare you? Why would you take my food away? That's not an appropriate social interaction. Your dog feels very similarly. When dogs feed around a food resource, free roaming dogs, then they respect each other's spaces and they will share and compete and edge in and out for that resource. But if there's an abundance of food, if everyone's sharing food, it will be quite cooperative. Similarly, obviously with your pet dog, when its food is presented to it and it's given its dinner, then your dog sees that as being its food, and it's incredibly rude for you to then come and take it away. By doing that, what you're doing is reinforcing any anxiety that your dog has about its food. You're teaching your dog, you are right to guard your food, you're right to protect it, because I'm going to take it away. And that just reinforces the anxiety and the fear. If you have a dog that's come from a shelter or a rescue environment that may be already quite protective over food resources, the way to alleviate that is to diffuse that anxiety by giving the dog more food, by showing that you're not a threat, by showing that you've got no intention of taking your dog's food away. You don't need to. There's really no circumstances where you need to do that. If you do, the chances of you doing that successfully are much higher if your dog isn't already anxious and guarding its food because you've taught it that you might take it away. So we want to be counter-conditioning those kind of anxieties by demonstrating to the dog that you're not a threat, that it doesn't need to be anxious, it doesn't need to be fearful that humans bring food, and that it doesn't need to protect its food against you. It can relax, it can be confident and eat its food in peace. So we need to think about the motivation for why dogs might behave as they do, and think about the logic behind some of these traditional training practices, which perhaps don't actually really make sense when we tease them apart a little bit.
Yeah, one of the things I really liked, I noticed on the discussion boards, somebody did point out that the original scientist who did the wolf work actually recanted and said that he then thought his methodology was flawed, which it was. And I think that's a really good example of when, even when a scientist can admit that they've made a mistake, sometimes that idea just grabs hold in popular culture and can't be shaken off, which is why it's very important that we continue to do this kind of education work. So yes, dogs, dominance, it's not a thing.
I read yes, in a nutshell. I read a brilliant quote today by someone called Keynes, and it said, "When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do?" And I think that's a really good quote, that we need to be looking at the most current research and basing our opinions on that, and not this outdated research that's been done decades ago and has been proven to be wrong time and time again.
Yeah. What other questions do we have?
We had a photograph posted onto the Google Hangout question board, and we can't share the photograph with you, but if you go to the Google Hangout question, you will see it. It's a photograph of a little dog that is tied up little puppy, only maybe 5 months old. It's tied up. It looks like it may have a bit of a roof of the house coming over its head. It's on a strip of concrete, but the chain is long enough for it to be able to walk on a little bit of grass. And I think it had access to water. And the person who posted that picture was asking what we thought of this dog's welfare. And we wanted to answer this question because we had a few things to say about this one. One of the main points is that you cannot base a welfare assessment on one individual photograph. It's impossible to do that. You can look at it and make a decision based on what you can see, what resources are available and the condition of the dog, but you certainly can't do a whole welfare assessment on it. And when we're doing welfare assessments, as Nat has probably told you in weeks 1 and 2, we need to be scientific, take a scientific approach to it, and we need to break it down to a framework. Obviously, one of the most straightforward and most popular ones that we could use would be the 5 freedoms. So we need to ask ourselves, if we're looking at any animal in any situation, does it have freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain, injury and disease, freedom to behave normally, and freedom from fear and distress. So if we were to just look at a photo, we couldn't possibly say if that animal was free from pain, injury or disease. Well, we could try and look at its body language and figure it out. We don't know if it's able to behave normally because we don't know if the dog is constantly on the lead or if it does get taken off the lead, or we don't know what's out of the photograph as well. So be aware of that. And also when we're assessing welfare, we can look at 4 different things as well. We can look at the animal's physical state, so its body condition, its skin, if it's any signs of disease or discharge or anything coming from it. We can also look at its physiological state, but with that we would need to take blood samples or urine samples and look at feces or hair samples to look to see what its cortisol levels are like, and Nat's spoken about that already. And then we can look at the animal's behaviour, which is the 3rd thing. And again, from a photograph, it's very difficult to assess an animal's behaviour. So we would want to do that over a period of time at different times of the day. And then finally, which we could do with a single photograph, is we can look at its environment and see what resources are available for that animal, if it has access to food, water, beds, companionship if necessary, shelter, and a stimulating environment. So thank you so much for posting the photo and giving us a chance to talk about it. But assessing welfare is far more complicated than a snapshot.
Absolutely. The thing about assessing welfare, you have to remember these frameworks give us a common language that we can use to discuss welfare. They give us things that we can look at, such as the environment, such as the animal's physical status. And you can adapt that based on your knowledge of the species that you are assessing. So if you're assessing a dog, think, what is it that a dog needs? This is what we say, or what we mean rather, when we say that a dog is a dog is a dog. Its welfare needs don't change. It still needs companionship. It still needs a suitable environment, a suitable stimulation. And we know what the suitable environment is through our experience with dogs, through the research that's been done with dogs, and a little bit as well through common sense. And that part is the part that I think trips some people up when they're trying to think about welfare assessment. They get very focused on a species and they think, oh, how can I assess welfare in this species? Your knowledge of the species will help you to assess welfare, but welfare assessment is a much more general process. It's one that we use frameworks for, and it's one that we use a methodology for, a scientific methodology. So use a framework and use your knowledge of the species.
I think that's a really good point, is as Jill said, focusing on what that species needs and looking at the frameworks. One of the things that came up in that question was perhaps this dog has better welfare than a dog in a shelter or on the street. Well, we haven't assessed the welfare of every dog in a shelter or of every dog on the street, and we haven't assessed the welfare of this dog in the photograph either, because that's impossible just from a snapshot. So we can't possibly make a judgment about a comparison as to whether a guard dog tied up has a better or worse welfare situation than a dog in a shelter or than a dog on the street. It's very individual, depends on that individual's previous experiences, its own personality, its own ability to cope with the challenges that it faces in its own environment, whether that's in the shelter, on the street, or as a pet. So we have to consider every animal as an individual, and we also have to compare the animal to what it needs, not to another dog in a worse situation, because comparing to the lowest common denominator doesn't really help us to improve welfare. We have to compare to what the animal actually needs to do that.
Definitely. So it's a very good question. Not a lot of people are posting questions on the app. If you have any questions, do, because otherwise we'll just ramble about the things that we're interested in.
We have quite a few viewers, but none of you are typing up. So
ask some questions. Yeah. Were there any others, Hayley, that you were very interested in?
Someone was asking, when I was talking about the ladder of aggression, if and how some little dogs don't bother showing all the stages of aggression because they've learned that there's no point, no one listens to them, so they go straight for the bite. And I've read comments, not from these students, I'm pleased to say, but from other people on the internet, that these dogs are, I've got small dog syndrome, or they are little bleeps, and it's completely inaccurate. So they were asking if maybe some smaller breeds of dogs have been bred, what was the word they used?
Bred for aesthetics.
Bred for aesthetics rather than for temperament, and have these this knowledge of going up the ladder, has it been bred out of these dogs?
Well, there was a study done by James Serpell, a paper published, and you can link to this on the Association of Pet Behaviour Counsellors website, looking at the validity of breed-specific legislation and whether certain breeds are more likely to bite or more likely to be aggressive than others, for example. And obviously, with that focus, quite often our focus is on the bull breeds as being, these big aggressive dogs, and they're the ones that everyone's worried about. And actually, Serpell's study showed that it was Chihuahuas and Dachshunds that temperamentally are more likely to demonstrate signs of inappropriate aggression. Of course, all dogs can be aggressive, and that aggression may be appropriate or inappropriate, but it's Dachshunds and Chihuahuas, which are perhaps not the breeds that we would consider to be dangerous dogs, that are temperamentally more likely to display that inappropriate aggression. So I think as we've said before, it's really important that a lot of these issues become myths in social media, or we get very worried about specific breeds being more or less aggressive than others. But actually, it's sometimes when we look at the science, we can find some surprising results.
I think it's very important that we draw a distinction here, because there could be two effects happening. There could be the effect of breeding. So we are selecting for a certain kind of aggressive trait, either deliberately or inadvertently, and that's somehow making these breeds more aggressive or more likely to have inappropriate aggression. Or there could be a second effect. It could be the way these dogs are kept just so happens to reinforce that kind of behavior. And it could be, and that's something that's actually easier to deal with, because it's something that the dogs are learning, and so through interventions we can improve that much more quickly than we could improve a breed effect. So it's our first line of defense in that sense should be to improve the welfare of the dogs right there, and to try and help those dogs to deal with their aggression appropriately, and to help them have an environment in which appropriate aggression is important. So that's one of the sort of things that you should definitely bear in mind when we are dealing with these kind of issues. If we can help if we can take the easy route and help the individuals, then we improve their welfare, we improve the situation, and we can then think about, is the problem also a longer term one of breeding, and how can we deal with that later? But for the animal's perception, it is the animal's perception of its environment which affects its welfare. So that's the individual approach. Kieran has asked us if the tea is good, and yes, the tea is very good.
We've just had a message pop up as well saying that there's a problem with the chat window on the Google Hangout, and that's perhaps why we're not getting questions through from people that are viewing. They don't seem to be able to find a space to type questions. But we do have a question.
Kieran's managed. Kieran, could you explain to others?
Is the tea good? I thought, have we only got one viewer? And he's asking about tea.
So you can only ask questions when you are watching through the Google Hangout app. If you roll your mouse towards that side of my left, I think it'll be your left as well, there will be a little pop-up bar will come up. There's a Q&A app, or it just says Q&A on the side of it. If you click on that, there should be a little white window popping up on the right hand side, and then you should be able to type in questions from there. That's the extent of technical advice I can give you at the present moment. So I do hope that works.
We have had one that has managed it already.
Kieran can do it. So if Kieran could explain to everybody else, I will relay that message.
If anyone has any dog or cat behavioural welfare questions, the tea is excellent. But if you have any other questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
Oh dear. Let me see what else we had. We had someone asking, not simply, but she was asking if animals need to show proof of their intelligence. She's saying that for many, many years, rabbits have had a very rough deal being stuffed away in hutches at the bottom of gardens, very little interaction from their owners, and their owners just didn't appreciate how intelligent they were. So, and she's now clicker trained one of her rabbits to perform over 100 tricks. And she's saying, is it important that animals show proof of their intelligence for them to receive better welfare?
I think that's a really good question, and I think often we have confused intelligence with sentience. And as Jeremy Bentham says, the question is not can they talk or can they reason, the question is can they suffer? And we need to separate those capacities out. But I do think that we do tend to bias animals depending on their role in our society, depending on how cute they might be, we'll feel more empathetic towards them, and also how smart they might be. We tend to have more respect for animals that can demonstrate their intelligence in a way that we understand. We have to remember that I think there's that great cartoon, if we judge all animals by their ability to climb a tree, then fish are going to fail. But fish are very, very good at surviving in the environment that they have adapted, that they've evolved for. And so I think it's important that we judge animal intelligence by the evolutionary process that those animals have gone through.
It's another case where there's a bit of a conflict between our ethical issue or our ethical stance and what we can actually measure and manage in the animal welfare science part of it. For animal welfare science, we always say that we're interested in how does the animal perceive its environment? Is that animal suffering? And the way that we measure that is through comparable biological systems. We understand that any animal which has a central nervous system, which has a brain, any vertebrate animal, has the ability to feel pain, to perceive that, and therefore to suffer. So we're automatically concerned with the welfare of any vertebrate animal. For the ones that are invertebrates or don't have a backbone, don't have the same sort of analogous systems, it becomes a little bit more complicated because actually we don't necessarily know as much about how they perceive their environment. Octopus are a really good example because we protect them in our legislation because we do know that they are capable of perceiving pain and also of suffering when they're in barren environments because they are very cognitively complex animals. They think, they want a challenging environment, they like that. And if you put them in a barren environment, their welfare suffers. So that's a really good example of where we have an invertebrate with a completely different biological system from us and other vertebrates and other mammals. And yet we still have to be very concerned about the welfare of this species. But then we come further down the scale to animals like sponges, for example, which have very little mobility, don't really perceive their environment in any way, shape or form. They're still part of the animal kingdom. Are we concerned with that welfare? I have an ethical problem with the destruction of coral reefs, but is it a welfare problem? So somewhere along the lines, there is a distinction to be made there. And in welfare, as Heather was saying, we're interested in whether or not the animal can suffer and how can we prevent that suffering.
And we'll touch on this a little bit in week 5 with some of the zoo animals because it comes back to how those animals perceive the world. And often we're quite anthropomorphic in how we judge animals to perceive the world, whether we judge them to be solitary or non-solitary based on how humans interact really, rather than how animals may interact with each other. There was a question that was posted on the thread earlier about whether dogs can communicate with each other and how they communicate with each other. Well, of course, yes, dogs do communicate. They're a social animal. But the way that they communicate is very, very different to the way that humans communicate. The majority of their communication is non-verbal. It's through body language. And they will emit, obviously, a variety of different vocalizations. But just from the way they move, from their body tension, their posture, their facial expressions, dogs will be able to infer a lot of different communication about each other. Of course, they also use their sense of smell, olfactory communication, to an extent that humans cannot even imagine. Our sense of smell is really ridiculously poor, but dogs can use that to communicate over quite a long distance. Everyone that's had a dog will have seen it sniffing at a lamppost, picking up the local information and messages from other dogs in the neighbourhood. And we have really no concept in ourselves as to how that works, but it's obviously a very important method of communication for our dogs.
Yes, intelligence is also quite a tricky one to talk about, because as you know, Heather mentioned about you can't judge a fish by its ability to climb trees, but where animals have other senses from us, so for example dolphins can use echolocation, we actually have very little information about what it's like to perceive something through that sense and what kind of intelligence you need to understand that information. So it's a difficult one. We have a selection of questions here.
Well done, everybody.
Well done, yes, I'm glad you all figured that out. What do we like?
I quite like that redirection.
Yeah,
as well.
okay.
So Heidi has asked, a dog was being very reactive to other dogs while being walked in the shelter. The dog redirected towards the volunteer and mauled her with life-threatening injuries. She's fine now, thank goodness for that. Why does this redirection occur?
You saw a nice example of redirection in one of Hayley's videos.
Yeah, the German Shepherd being redirected to, well, the Doberman redirecting to German Shepherd.
The German Shepherd, yeah. And that happens usually when a dog becomes so wound up, so excited that they cross over what we call their reactivity threshold. And that can easily then move even further on if the stimulation doesn't stop into a bite threshold. In the video that Hayley showed, the reason that that Doberman was so wound up, so excited, so reactive was because there was a group of people just off camera that you couldn't see. Those people were not actually interacting with the Doberman at all. And that Doberman was desperate for human attention. And he was doing everything that he could to get the human's attention, and they carried on ignoring him.
You see he's play bowing and he's wagging his tail and he's asking for them to come over, and it's not working.
And he gets more and more and more frustrated because all of those communications that we've just talked about were totally ignored. The humans weren't recognizing them as being an invitation to socialize, which is what he really wanted. And so he was left in his kennel, and the only thing in his kennel was that German Shepherd. And so that German Shepherd is the only focus that he has to display his aggression on. And we see this quite often with dogs that are perhaps anxious or show aggression towards other dogs when they're out being walked. Perhaps they're on a lead, they can't get to the other dog, which is the focus and the source of their frustration, their aggression, or their anxiety. They have to display those emotions in some way, and so they turn around to the thing that's nearest to them, and that can often, unfortunately, be a human being that's walking them.
But human beings can do this in their own environment.
Absolutely.
Where your wife or your husband picks on you, you've had a horrible argument with them, you can't say what it is you want to say, you walk off and you kick the cat. And the cat's done nothing wrong, but that's what you're going to focus. Hopefully you're not going to kick the cat and you're going to throw a cushion or
throw a mug against the wall. Or,
but that's when your frustration is vented on something else because you're so wound up.
Screaming into a pillow is what I do.
Yeah.
Or you have a terrible day at work and you come home and pick a fight with your boyfriend because that's a safe way of venting your frustration. I never do that.
No, I'm not speaking from experience. Long suffering. Thank you for that question.
It was a great question, Heidi. What are the ones?
Let's have a look.
Speciesism. Yeah, that's a really good one.
So Petra asks, my question is about speciesism. We could see that dogs and cats are also in certain cultures taken as food, which in our culture we think is barbaric. However, we know that pigs are smart as dogs, but still it's fine for us to use them. How does this speciesism affect the way we think about animal welfare?
That's a great question, Petra, and it's one of my sort of pet soapbox subjects.
See what you did there.
There's been quite a lot of research that shows that the way that we perceive an animal, its role in our society, influences how we think it's acceptable to treat that animal. So in the category of production animals, we treat them very differently than we would companion animals, pet animals, pest animals, so rats and mice and other pests that we consider to be vermin, we also treat very differently than we would our companion animals or even our production animals. So we have these societally imposed approvals or acceptances of ways in which it's acceptable or not acceptable to treat different species depending on the category that we put them in. And of course, in different cultures, different species of animal fall into different categories. And as you mentioned, in some cultures, dogs and cats are acceptable in terms of their role as a food source. Similarly, in countries like India, there may be cultural taboos against the use of certain species like cattle, or in some areas of India, pigs, as a food source. And so different species are acceptable or unacceptable in different cultures, depending on their role and their value within that society. As animal welfareists, what we would want to ask is the welfare of the animal used in that system acceptable? Is it acceptable? Is there a way of humanely farming or transporting or slaughtering that species? Are there safeguards in place to ensure that that animal's welfare is protected regardless of its role in that society? And those, I think, are the important questions.
And yeah, and if this animal is going to be used in society, how can we maximize that animal's welfare? A lot of what we do in animal welfare science is accepting the system in some respects, because we accept that there are production animals in the world. So how can we act to improve their welfare while they're still within that system? So it was very interesting.
It doesn't mean that you're not allowed an emotional response to a particular situation either. They will all have different moral and ethical viewpoints on how acceptable or unacceptable we feel that an animal's use might be in a particular situation. But in order to work effectively, what we have to do is look at the animal's experience, the animal's welfare, and try and ensure that's the best it can possibly be.
So what other questions have we got?
There was one that came up about, we know that animals have a superior sense of smell. Here we go. You mentioned that compared to humans, animals such as dogs have a superior ability to smell. Do you think animals also have a superior ability to pick up on human emotions? Which is a very interesting question. And we know that research has been done recently where they've proven that dogs, most of us as dog owners will know this anyway, but dogs can tell when we are feeling unhappy, and dogs can tell when we are feeling happy, and they will adapt their body language and behavior to be in accordance with ours. They'll come out and looks like they're giving us sympathy. They'll put their head on our lap. One thing that I would like to but make a point of is that dogs, I think when people come home and the dog has been in the bin or chewed something up in the house or pooed in the house, and the dog has that guilty look on its face, and the owners always say the dog knows it's done wrong. That is incorrect. The dog doesn't know it's done wrong. What the dog is picking up on is a situation it's found itself in before, where it's been in the bin or it's pooed in the house, and you have reacted in the past to what it's done, and you will have given off a body language, a certain stance, a facial expression that the dog can also remember from the previous experience. So it puts two and two together, and it behaves in an appeasing way to calm you down because previously it was punished. I know lots of you are going to come on and say that you never punished your dogs, and the dog definitely does know when it's doing wrong. But for example, my dog Stuart, who features heavily in my MOOC, the little blonde dog I rescued, he has separation anxiety, and he has chewed up a lot of my property, doors, sofas, ski jackets, Uggs, underwear, all sorts. He's chewed it up. I hope my landlord's not watching this. And every time I've come home and found the destruction, because it is destruction, I have never ever reacted. And therefore, when I do come home and find this, I've done a lot of separation training, and this is almost a thing of the past, but every time I came home, I would never react angrily to what he'd done, because it's not his fault. He's not doing it out of spite. He's not doing it to show me that I shouldn't leave him on his own. And therefore, when I come home and I see this destruction, he doesn't react with appeasing behavior, because he doesn't know he's done wrong. In his mind, he has just coped with the situation he's found himself in. And so dogs, saying that your dog knows it's done wrong is probably a previous learning experience where it used appeasing behavior, which to us looks like apology or guilt, but it's not.
I think also as well, when Hayley mentions the term punishment, we need to remember that, again, for dogs, their perception of punishment is much broader than ours. It's not necessarily physically hitting a dog or physically punishing it. It can be as simple as withdrawn contact or reduced eye contact, or you go, oh, for goodness sake, and raising your voice, or being very tense because you're frustrated with the damage a dog has done, or the fact that it's damaged something in the house. And for a dog, because they are very sensitive, and many dogs are very sensitive to human emotions and human behavior, that in and of itself can be punishing. That lack of eye contact, that lack of normal greeting and normal attention that the dog would perhaps expect when you get home, perhaps a raised voice, or you just being withdrawn and clearing everything up. Those things can be perceived as punishment to a dog because it's outside of its normal routine. So we need to ensure that we're being clear and using that term quite broadly.
It's an interesting question, Karen.
Yes. Okay, so he says his question's too long, so we'd have to go to the following thread. Bear with us a second. Let's just check if there's any.
Quite like this one.
Yeah,
because we
put that one up.
This is from Timothy. So Timothy says, in Gemma Pearson's video, she was talking about horses needing freedom and proper feeding. And she was doing this with a horse in a box eating hay from a high-mounted hay rack. Surely, as a horse behaviour specialist, we should be showing the correct environment.
I think that's a really good point. But I think also, as with all of the videos that we've shown, it's unfortunately always going to be a toss-up between the logistical practicalities of what we can show on a particular day. If it's absolutely peeing it down, and please do remember we're in Scotland here, then it can sometimes make filming that's scheduled on a particular day in a particular environment quite challenging. And so there are always those logistical constraints. Also, hay, I think, is a reasonable alternative to grass. It's horses have evolved as foragers and browsers, and that still offers them that opportunity. We all know that stabling or long periods of isolation stabling can be detrimental to horse welfare, and I don't think that has been skirted over in the course at all. But we also need to recognise that it's a way that many people manage their horses.
I presume he's also picking on the fact that the hay rack is a high-mounted one, which we know is not a natural height for horses to eat from, and it impinges on drainage from the nose, and they would naturally eat downhill. But that is the way those stables
It's a
are set
hygiene
up.
issue, unfortunately.
Yeah, the way those stables were set up.
Yeah.
I think it's,
but we do appreciate
remember,
your comments. Yes.
We also have the equitation science MOOC, or the horse nutrition MOOC.
Yes, equine nutrition.
Yeah.
Equine nutrition.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you can always head along there as well. It's a very good MOOC. What else do we have? Somebody's saying it works. Yes, the questions work. We're very pleased.
Right. If you're just looking now, oh well, that was quite an interesting one.
Oh, that is very interesting. So this is from Kira. In human therapists, we know of ways of offloading and debriefing after therapy. Do you know of any way of assisting therapy animals to shed negativity picked up during their work? This is really interesting because the use of animals in therapy has been quite well studied, and very much from the human perspective. So we know that pets being used as therapy in hospitals, particularly for things like sick children, really improves the welfare of the children, and it's a great therapy method. So it works very well for humans. Occasionally, there have been some studies looking at how does it affect the animals, and they mostly focus on dogs because dogs are most commonly used as therapy animals. Now, you have to remember there are lots of different kinds of therapy, and helping animals range from guide dogs, which go through very intense training and are very rigorously selected for. So if a dog shows any sign of stress or not being able to cope with the situation in guide dog training, for example, it's removed from the program and it doesn't continue as a therapy dog. But you have other therapy dogs who are taken into hospitals, quite often in quite unfamiliar environments with a lot of really strange sensations, very strange smells, very strange noises, people who don't behave in the way that a dog recognizes a person as behaving normally, people who are very slow and are feeling pain. And these are very strange sensations for a dog. And there has been some evidence to show that sometimes these dogs have elevated cortisol levels throughout the training method, throughout the therapy session. So I actually don't know very much about how people who work in this field try and relax their dog afterwards. But it's coming back to this training. You have to think about how is the dog perceiving its environment? How can you encourage the dog to stay calm? How can you make the whole experience a pleasant one for the dog? And it's a very interesting question. And I don't know if you guys know any more about what particularly people do during therapy sessions or after therapy sessions.
No, I think it depends, as you said, on whether it's a dog or an animal that is within the household that's a permanent therapy dog or therapy pet. Or whether it's an animal that's going for one of those visiting sessions. We actually have, it's our student welfare day here at the University of Edinburgh today, and we actually have some dogs downstairs which the students have been using for a de-stressing session. And we have quite strict guidelines in place on how those dogs can be used and the types of dogs that are used. We would want it to be an enjoyable experience for the dog. So we would want to only recruit dogs that are actively engaged and social with people. If they're a bit fearful of people, or they don't like a certain kind of person, or they don't like a certain environment, then bringing them into that environment is going to be negative and stressful and potentially end up in a potential aggressive outcome, which is no good for the people or the dogs. I think when a dog is very much part of a home and is an assistance dog, then its capacity for being able to debrief is probably quite challenged. If we consider, for example, a guide dog's opportunity for off-lead exercise, or a disability assistance dog's opportunity for off-lead exercise. And I know that this is an area of ongoing research, and it's something that the major assistance charities are considering. Yeah,
it's a bit of a tricky situation in some ways, particularly for the in-house therapy dogs. And they very often have short work span lives. Guide dogs I know are replaced fairly frequently, actually, within a number of years, because it's very hard work for those dogs. I mean, they're amazing animals that are incredibly well trained. So if you are interested in any sort of pet therapy, or you're going to do any type of this, always remember, think about the animal's welfare. As Heather said, our ones that we have downstairs at the moment, there's very strict guidance there. Ask about the guidance if you're ever in that situation. Ask how the animals are doing, and if it doesn't seem right to you, then I would sort of question it, basically. So thank you, Kira. Did you have that question from the forums? Was it one?
There was one here about, if we go back, no, your question hasn't come up, so we just need to go out of here. This one, someone from Singapore, talking about, let's just read it, it's quite a long one, hang on. Okay, the spotlight was on street dogs near a train station, and were the street dogs increasing rat infestations?
Because people are leaving food out to feed the dogs.
And that's increasing the rat population. Okay. The dogs aren't the root of the problem, but irresponsible feeding.
What is your opinion on responsible or irresponsible feeding of street animals? Is it really best to organise feeding efforts to better aid trap and neuter, or and regular volunteers instead of spontaneous feeding?
This is very, it comes up a lot, especially recently. There was a lot of controversy in Rome, because Rome has a large population of cat colonies, feral cat colonies, and they're very frequently fed by the locals, and there was a lot of public outcry, I think, when a couple of years ago they decided to try and stop this. People want to feed animals.
I'm a feeder. I can't help myself. I even fed pigeons when I lived in Paris. I was hugely unpopular there.
It's a really tricky thing, and it's one of those human issues where we're not necessarily always helping the situation by what makes us feel good inside. And it's a question that kind of comes down to, how does the culture want to deal with it? How does the local government want to deal with it? And when we talk about the animals' welfare and the welfare of the street dog, if you're a street dog and you have a fairly regular source of food, that's great. You know, that's good for you, right?
One of the things we need to consider as well is that when dogs and cats, street dogs and cats, are breeding, their carrying capacity of the local environment will depend on the food resources that are available. So we have people that are regularly feeding, we're going to get increased litter size, increased survival of puppies and kittens, and then we have more and more animals on the street, and obviously the problem just keeps on growing and growing. The flip side of that is that if we have people who are perhaps cultivating a relationship with those animals or feeding responsibly, they may be able to be more effective at trapping those animals so that they can be neutered. So perhaps the solution is very controlled feeding with a specific target in mind, and then once animals have been neutered, the feeding can stop and the population will stabilise at that carrying capacity and hopefully won't continue to grow.
It's an interesting situation where the immediate welfare of the individual animal is not necessarily the same outcome as the long-term welfare of the population. And these kind of situations do happen, where, particularly in conservation work as well, and Heather will talk to you a lot about that in week 5, I think. But it's interesting, because what's good for the individual animal is sometimes not really the best thing for the whole population at large, and the feeding is a very good example of that. So we have here, I think this is definitely one for you guys.
I want to ask how to increase the welfare of dogs and cats in veterinary clinic ward. We do separate and cats into different rooms, but what other enrichment can we do for these stressful animals, these stressed animals in their new environment? That is a great question. And I am a veterinary nurse and Heather is a veterinary surgeon. So we've spent a lot of time, in the clinic environment. We have to obviously recognise it's a hugely alien environment. They're scared, they're separated from their owners, they're usually sick or in pain. There's lots of different humans and other animals around and loud noises from equipment. They might not be getting fed the food they want. They might not even be on the type of bed they want or getting the litter that they want if they're a cat. So it is a very difficult situation for them. What we can do to minimise stress for these animals is brilliant that you separate cats and dogs. That's a great start. We can also try and make them as comfortable as we possibly can so that they have access to a comfortable bed, fresh water, food that they enjoy. And also cats must have litter trays. And I see so often when I travel to different countries, cats without litter trays. And sometimes the reason given for this is because the cats don't use litter trays at home. But obviously these cats are then going outside to go to the toilet. So they need to have access when they're in a confined space. Otherwise the cats will hold it. They're so clean. And this will cause urinary tract infections. The other thing, feline facial pheromone called Feliway, which is made, am I allowed to endorse? By Seva. I don't know if I was allowed to endorse, by a company called Seva, C-E-V-A, and you can get this as a plug-in pheromone, which will release the pheromone that relaxes the cats. You can also use it as a spray on your hands, and you spray that on a minute before handling the cat, and I've seen really good results with that. For dogs, there is a tablet version available of a pheromone or even a collar, which my dog wears all the time, and like an anti-anxiety collar, which calms them down. The other thing we can do is make sure we assess their behaviour properly and assess them pre-surgery so that we know what their normal behaviour is, so that we can then assess them for pain or normal behaviour and patterns after surgery. Look at the position that they sit in the cage. Anxious animals will be at the back of the cage, but if an animal was originally at the front of the cage and then starts going towards the back, this can be a sign that they're either anxious or that they're also in pain. There's lots of research been done about this. And one of the other things that we can do, and this is quite tricky, one other thing is make sure they have a routine so that they know what to expect. We've done research to show that predictability reduces stress. So make sure they have a regular pattern of when they're fed, when they're taken out for walks. But one of the number one things you can do, and this is quite tricky in a very busy clinic with limited staff, is create the friendly nurse. What, sorry? I was going to say friend. A friend, yeah. You give that animal a friend, and that nurse or that vet or that animal care assistant, kennel worker, whichever, is that animal's friend and that animal's little guardian whilst it's in the vets. So that person would never do anything painful. So as vets and nurses, we don't want to do the painful stuff to the animals, but we have to. And sometimes we take it out to walk it, and sometimes we take it out and we give it an injection or we place an IV cannula. This is hugely stressful for the animal. They don't know which it is you're going to do to them. So if you create someone who is a friend and that person never does anything harmful, never does anything painful, then that animal feels like it has someone on its side and it will be more relaxed when that person is around. And if you can do that in your practice, you will improve the welfare dramatically for those patients when they feel they've got someone on their side. So even though they want to be with humans, they want to be with their owner. If they can't be with their owner, you need to find the next best thing for them in the practice, which would be the friendly nurse, as we call it.
That's interesting. I want to ask a question here of our two veterinary specialists. I was once told by a vet of my acquaintance that he didn't like to have any owners in the back of the veterinary clinic or in the clinic environment because he didn't want the pet to associate the owner with that horrible experience. Is that quite common?
I think there's a number of reasons for not having the owner in the back. That's definitely one of them. Another one is that animals often behave quite differently when their owners are present compared to when their owners are absent. The owners are a resource, and they're a really valuable resource. And so animals will want to be with their owner the whole time, and can often be much more difficult to handle if the owner is nearby because they'll be struggling to get back to their owner the whole time. So I think actually sometimes having that absolute separation can be less stressful for the animal because at least then they're not trying to access their owner or trying to be near their owner the whole time. I think it's also probably a bit less stressful for the owner in many situations.
Certainly for me, I just had my little kitten spayed quite recently and it was a horribly stressful experience for me. She loved it. Did she? She made friends with all of the nurses. She had a very pleasant evening of being slightly stoned.
Good.
I was very stressed. It's a really interesting question, Ria.
Yeah. Okay, do we have any more questions coming in from the
There's
board?
some that aren't coming into here, but they are going to the email.
Okay.
That's
We're only got about 10 minutes left, so we should pick a couple of good ones. I could definitely talk about that one.
It's one that Jill will like, so we'll go with that
So
one.
Steve has been has lucked out in asking a question about something I did a PhD on. So I'm really into this kind of thing. So Steve asks, how can temperament play a role in terms of adapting to the environment? For example, if a terrier is living in a flat wherein the terrier naturally likes to hunt, chase and catch, how does it adapt to that? And likewise, some large dogs can become couch potatoes. So is breed temperament more important than size? Now, you're asking two questions in one here, Steve. We have differences in temperament in crossbreeds, and we understand this. We actually select for this. We select for working dogs that are very energetic and like to be out and about and performing tasks and get very bored in very barren environments. And we also have other dogs breeds that we've selected for, like terriers, which have different temperament traits. So we have this variation on a breed level, with different breeds having slightly different places on this sort of temperament scale. But within each breed, there are then variation between individual dogs. So you get the occasional lazy terrier, I have seen him, and you also get the occasional very excited greyhound. And this variation happens. So yes, you should try and select a breed which is suitable for your lifestyle. And there's a lot of sort of discussion about that. For example, I live in a very small flat, so I wouldn't necessarily get a Bernese Mountain Dog, much as I love them and adore them. And temperament is just one aspect of that. If you don't have a huge amount of time, you definitely shouldn't get a dog which is very active. But the more important part of temperament really for the animal is the variation that the animal has itself from normal. And this is what people find quite difficult to deal with, particularly in pets, especially if they have selected a breed that they think the animal is going to be the breed standard, and they believe that they've got a dog that has, for example, a lot of the breed standards say things like this breed is very accepting and sociable, and then you just happen to get the one that isn't. And people find that quite difficult to deal with, and they don't always recognise that the individual animals themselves can have different temperaments. So is breed temperament more important than size? I would argue that yes, you should definitely have a good think about temperament before you select a breed. But of course, size is important as well. And greyhounds are a pretty good example of this. People tend to think of them as being high energy dogs, but actually they're rather lazy animals, and they just, especially if you adopt an ex-racer, they just really like to lie about on the couch all day. In fact, our old greyhound, I couldn't even drag him out on a walk some mornings. He would take one look at the snow outside and say, no, I'm not going. So yeah, it's a very interesting question, Steve. Thank you for letting me talk about temperament.
Have we got any more?
just Nat, who's watching from home.
Oh, hello, Nat. I hope your back's okay.
Do you have
responses?
It's an interesting question just about, do we have references about how to interact with cats in the home environment, and what do they need for welfare? We'll have a little look and we'll put some references on. I think that's actually an area which is quite understudied in a lot of ways.
There's a really good guide by the International Society for Feline Medicine, the ISFM. If you go to their website, they have a really good guide that's free and open access, and it's on environmental enrichment for cats in the home, and it talks about a whole range of different things that you can do in terms of feeding, toileting, provision of toys, provision of different accessories that you can give for cats in the home. So that's really useful.
Yeah. What's it, the name again, Heather?
The International Society for Feline Medicine, ISFM, and it's their environmental enrichment guide. So if you Google that, you should be able to pick it up online.
And if I don't post a link, somebody remind me, because I'll just have forgotten. I will do that. So this is a really interesting question. So Natalie says, About controlling animals' social lives. When is it too early for a puppy to get out to meet other dogs? The vet is giving the advice that it should be after the puppy gets all of its shots, which would be around 6 months. But the trainer is saying that it should be earlier. So here we've got advice from 2 different specialists saying slightly different things.
Yeah, you're. I'm not sure which country you're in. I'm assuming you're not in the UK. The legislation that guides when vaccinations can be given to dogs varies from country to country. In the UK, we routinely give vaccinations, the first vaccination at between 8 and 10 weeks of age, and then the second vaccination between 12 to 14 weeks of age, so about 2 to 4 weeks apart. So the dog is normally vaccinated within its socialization period. The socialization period for dogs ranges from about 6 through to about 13 weeks of age. And if they experience things during that time period, then they will grow to accept them, assuming that those things have been introduced in a positive manner. So if you want your dog to be comfortable around traffic or horses or cats or children, then it's really, really important that those things are introduced between that socialization window. You can often do that in a very safe way, so you can carry the dog rather than having it walking around, so it's less likely to be infected with any infectious diseases. It's very difficult to give hard and fast rules for every dog in every situation. The disease prevalence will vary from country to country and region to region, and the risk of behavioural disorders that might emerge due to poor socialisation will vary depending on the individual dog. But we do know from research that's been demonstrated that that early socialisation period is of vital importance in developing a dog and reducing anxiety and potential fear aggression later in life. Certainly within the UK, the number of dogs euthanised due to behavioural disorders far exceeds the number of dogs euthanised due to, or that die, because of infectious disease transmission. And so in the UK, it's about balancing those risks and trying to manage that individual dog in a safe way, but ensuring that it gets to interact with other dogs and other animals and people as much as possible as well.
Yeah, basically, as a young puppy, expose it safely and positively to as many things, as many situations and as many experiences as you possibly can. This is people wearing helmets, buses, motorbikes, people of different ethnicity, other animals, children especially. Get them exposed to children, because once that window of opportunity is gone, as Heather said, it's very difficult to get them to be comfortable and relaxed in these situations. And also if they have very negative experiences in that window of opportunity, which is up to around 13, 14 weeks, then that's going to stay with them long term. So you want to try and avoid as many negative interactions as possible in that period as well. Otherwise you can have a dog that's forever scared of motorbikes or forever scared of children who wear baseball caps or
the
whichever.
Hoover, the coffee grinder, all of these strange and weird things.
For my dog, people in hoodies or hats. It's tiring in Scotland where it rains all the time. Every day is a challenge.
I think I socialised my kitten a little bit too well, because I had a house party the other day and she was bullying all of the guests into making them pay attention to her.
So actually the socialisation window for kittens is much earlier. It's from around 3 to around 7 or 8 weeks. And so you're often relying on the breeder to do a lot of the socialisation for you. But if you do get them access to them quite early, then just socialising them as much as you possibly can.
Very important, particularly for cats, actually. I think this is quite an interesting question. So Kat has asked, should we be discouraging people from insisting on purebred pets given the health issues, some of which we described in the week's lectures, and the puppy mills which result in animal cruelty and cater to these human demands for purebred? So again, we have a case where people are wanting something out of their pets that isn't necessarily the best welfare outcome. There's been quite a lot of interesting discussion on this from the board. We've got some students who work within the breeding industry of dogs and who try to breed in a responsible manner. And that's a very good point, actually. You should not tar a whole selection with one brush. You know, if you have a responsible breeder, somebody who's interested in whether the breed has health issues, so things like hip dysplasia in German Shepherds, for example, and labs. There's all sorts of eye conditions, skin problems, and even the more morphological differences that Dr. Runa Packer was talking about, things like the brachiocephalics,
the squash noses.
The squash-nosed breeds as well. if you have a responsible breeder who is going to approach those issues head on, and also has a pro-welfare attitude to things, they can make a huge amount of difference. But the puppy mills, which cater for these fads very often, so at the moment there's definitely in Edinburgh a huge fad for husky dogs. I've seen loads of
Labradoodles,
pugs.
So it doesn't even have to be a specific breed. It can be a fashionable crossbreed. I think it's definitely not a breeding versus mongrel or crossbreed issue. I think it's a responsible breeding issue. Puppy mills are never going to breed responsibly because what they're trying to do is mass produce something that looks like the dog is supposed to and get it out to a mass market, irrespective of its health condition. And they're not interested in the condition of the breeding bitches either, whereas a responsible pedigree dog breeder will be. And I think it's also important to recognise that people will want specific breeds and they will want them for specific reasons. So, for example, that might be for service dogs, for particular guarding reasons, or for working dogs for shepherding or huskying. Not such an issue in the UK, but an issue in other parts of the world. And so those dogs do have a utility value. And also for some families, particular breeds suit their lifestyle better, or their temperaments may be more suited to living at home as a family pet. And so responsible breeding of pedigree dogs can have some positive welfare impacts if those animals are then suited to the lifestyle that they've been bred for. But of course, that's a separate issue, I think, from irresponsible dog breeding, which can happen with crossbreeds as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's really, as Heather says, it's a matter of behaving responsibly and assuming a duty of care for the animals that you are responsible for.
I think if you're thinking about buying a dog or a cat, puppy or a kitten, then certainly do not buy one from the internet. Gumtree or eBay or any of the websites are not a good outlet for sourcing a pet.
Don't meet someone at a petrol station halfway and they give it to you from the boot of their car. That we see that.
Certainly if you're buying any pet, and this goes for exotic pets as well, which are often traded across the internet, buying from a reputable breeder in a valid retail outlet, such as either a pet shop or from a reputable breeder where you visit the home and you get to meet at least the mother of the dog or cat, and ideally the father as well. Get some history, meet the parents, see the dog in its environment, see how it's been raised, because those kind of experiences will stay with that dog, as we've talked about with its socialization period. If it's been isolated for the first 8 or 10 weeks of its life, then that will have an impact on its behavior for the rest of its life. And so really get as much information as you can from your breeder. Pick a confident, bold, exploratory puppy. Don't pick a puppy that's nervously cowering at the back of its cage or its enclosure, because all of those things can lead to behaviour problems later on.
All that said, don't overlook your local rescue shelter as well, because there's a champion of the rescue dog.
Absolutely.
Plenty of dogs out there that need homes.
Yeah, definitely.
And there are even charities out there which will rehome specific breeds.
Yeah,
if you are really have your heart set on a breed, you can also rescue breed animals as well.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've probably got time for maybe one more question. So should we have a little look at what looks very interesting?
We got any new ones through on the email?
Just have a check.
Yeah, that if I do
more. We've answered that one. What's this one?
That was just a response. That was just a response.
Okay. We answered that one.
We have pretty much. So there was just one, which was this one, which is maybe a little bit sad to end off on.
To end on this one.
But Kieran has asked, often owners will simply not admit to themselves that a dog or a pet animal is suffering in old age and the time has come. Are there any studies on euthanasia of dogs?
James Yates, who is the chief vet for the RSPCA in the UK, has written extensively on this subject, and so he's got papers that are published, and actually also a book which is published, I think, by U4, the University's Federation of Animal Welfare, which is about ethics of veterinary practice and touches on the subject of the ethical decision making around euthanasia. So some of those resources may be useful. The British Veterinary Association Animal Welfare Foundation, which is a charitable arm of the BVA, also has a guide to euthanasia on their website, and that can be found at the Animal Welfare Foundation's website, and that's a free download, and that talks about managing the situation of euthanasia. I think we have to remember that owners will always, or good owners at least, will always be emotionally bonded to their pet. And even if the animal is old or has had a chronic medical condition, then trying to make that judgment about making the decision to put your animal to sleep is always going to be an incredibly emotional and traumatic decision for any animal owner. I know that I've had to make that decision before for my own pets, and it's incredibly difficult. Conversely, I've been on the other side and been the vet that's had to recommend euthanasia for pets as well. I think as a vet, often you can be a lot more objective about the animal's welfare, but the owner is the person that's lived with the animal for 24 hours a day, and they often have a much broader picture of what the animal's welfare is over a longer period of time. I think for me, talking about the animal's future quality of life is a useful way of getting the owners to recognise that their animal is on a downhill slide. If the animal is currently in a situation where it's not able to do any of the things that it enjoys, it can't go for nice walks off the lead, it can't play, it's not romping around or having positive social interactions, it's perhaps not enjoying its food in the way that it used to, and there's no likelihood that that situation is going to improve because the animal has a chronic health condition or a terminal illness, then getting the owner to recognise that the animal's quality of life is already impaired and is likely to get worse. What's the benefit to the animal of keeping it alive? If tomorrow is not going to be any better than today, and today wasn't very good, then what about tomorrow? What about the next day? And what about the next day? And that can often get the owner to think about those things. The International Fund for Animal Welfare, I4, have a free downloadable resource on their website which goes through various algorithms about making decisions for euthanasia, depending on whether the animal has a physical health condition, a behavioural health condition, or perhaps it's in a shelter and there aren't enough resources to actually maintain it in a good quality of life. And again, that's a free internet download. So if you Google I4 euthanasia algorithm, you should be able to find that. That's a very useful guide.
It's never an easy decision, and one of my first research projects was looking at how people cope after the death of a companion animal. And what's very interesting is people very often feel the need to justify their actions, and they reiterate clinical information. People like to fall back on something that's very objective and that they can point to. They don't tend to like using their feelings, even though the feelings really dominate that whole decision-making process. So it's a very complicated process. Well, I think that's going to be it for us. We have been dominating your time for an hour now. I'd just like to remind you again to come onto the forums. Remember, if you like these videos, do like, share and subscribe, because then YouTube will start recommending us to other people and we can get the animal welfare message out there even further. And if you haven't already, do take a look at the Street Dog short film.
Yes.
It's really, really good.
And do let us know what you think about it on the forums as well.
Yeah.
We'd be interested to hear your feedback.
Tweet us.
We'll tell our cameraman.
We will indeed. He's very proud of it and we're very proud of it as well. It's a really cute little video. So bye guys, we will see you.
Thanks very much. Thank you for your questions. Bye.